We're reading The Year of Miss Agnes by Kirkpatrick Hill, and today we're on chapter 7 and 8. Miss Agnes used the big map to teach us geography. She pointed out the continents with a yardstick, and she showed us how to find Alaska every time. We had to look for the old man's beard and the fat nose. The beard was all of the islands, the Aleutian Islands. I never knew about those. Then she took out a folded up map, a map of just Alaska. It was as big as 2 desks, so we pushed little Pete and Roger's desk together, and there we were. There was the Koyukuk River, our river, and the Yukon down below us, and all the villages, even Dolby, our old village that no one lived in anymore. And there were Fairbanks and Anchorage, and all the little creeks there, and the long lakes and the sloughs. Little Pete and Roger just got excited, showing us where their trap line was and where they set the blackfish trap and where their dad shot the bear. It was so interesting somehow seeing it on paper. I never saw the big boys so excited about anything in school. I asked Miss Agnes where Juneau was, and she showed me way down at the bottom in the part she said was called the Panhandle because that part looked like a long handle and the rest of Alaska looked like a pan. I ran my finger from where we were on the Koyukuk River to Juneau and thought of Daddy making that long trip. It was a long way to go to die. Miss Agnes said she was going to teach us every one of the countries on the big map, so we'd know everything about the world. There were places that were hot all the time and where they had never seen snow. There were places where it was cold all winter and hot in the summer. I could hardly wait. After Miss Agnes folded up the big Alaska map, she gave us all a paper with arithmetic on it. She'd made one for each of us, but they were all different. Charlie Boy's and Selena's just had the numbers on them and places to draw things, to see if they could count like. I was 10, so my paper had some hard adding and some hard takeaways. Marie's and little Pete's and Roger's had a lot more on it than mine did. I always hated arithmetic, and I always just wrote any old numbers down before so I wouldn't have to think about it. And if the teacher wanted to make me do it right, I would cry and carry on. Then they would just leave me alone about it. Even if writing was fun when Miss Agnes showed us how, there was no way she could make arithmetic fun. After she walked around to see how many of us could do the figuring on our papers, she told us the story of Sam Durbin. That's the old man who had a mother named Frederica. Sam Durbin came from far away too, a place above the boot, Yugoslavia or something. And then he made a store here long ago, around Alakkeet. He made a lot of money there because there were a lot of mining camps around here in the old days, and those miners would buy anything. But old Durbin couldn't read, and he couldn't do arithmetic, only a little. After a while, people began to cheat him, and he lost all his money. He had to go back to where he came from, broke. All that money he got cheated out of because he couldn't do his arithmetic. Miss Agnes was going to teach us so that no one could cheat us. Like if we went to a trader in Fairbanks and sold our furs, when they added it up, we'd know if they'd shorted us. Or if we went to a store and gave them money, we'd know if they gave us back the wrong change. Or charged us too much. It could happen if you weren't smart. So right there, I made up my mind I was going to get good at this number stuff. After school, little Pete ran home and got his dad, Big Pete, to come and look at the map of Alaska. I was staying after to help Miss Agnes. I didn't want to go home. I didn't want school to end even. Big Pete was embarrassed to come into the school. I could tell. He didn't speak English too good, so he just nodded his head up and down when Miss Agnes talked to him. But he got all excited over the map too and started talking in Athabascan to little Pete. One place on the map he said was wrong. Some way the creek turned like. Seemed like they looked at that map for a long time, and then finally they left. It was really funny about Big Pete because he was the littlest man you ever saw. He was just a little bit bigger than me. Mama said he was always like that, just a little thing. And when he got married to Lena and they had little Pete, that's when they started calling him Big Pete. But now little Pete was way bigger than his father, way bigger than anyone else in the village. Little Pete was just a giant, and he was still growing, Grandpa said. His head just scraped the top of the school door. And Big Pete was like a wolverine, Grandpa said. He could get madder than anyone. And if he was mad at little Pete, it would look so funny, him looking up at little Pete, and little Pete just looking down at him, scared like. Little Pete was gentle and kind as a big moose, and here he had this scrappy little father. After they left, I helped Miss Agnes wipe the desks off with hot soapy water. And then Miss Agnes washed the blackboards so it was perfect again. I couldn't do it like that. I always got it smeary. I watched her long, skinny arms up and down, up and down. She moved so fast, always. Miss Agnes, I said, why did you quit teaching school at Alakkeet? Goodness, it was about time I quit. All those children must have got tired of me long ago. She looked at me to see if that was a good enough answer, but she could see it wasn't, so she got serious. It was time for me to go home, she said. I hadn't been to England for a very long time. I didn't mean to stay in this country so long. It was only to be a few years. Then the war started, and I didn't want to go back to England when the war was on. I knew about that war. Gilbert Dendoff had gone off to fight in the war, and old man Anderson was always listening to the radio and reading newspapers and talking to the old men about it. He used to get pretty excited. I had forgotten about that war. I was really little when it ended. My mother wrote to me every year to come home. I looked at her with interest. To think of Miss Agnes having a mother. What could her mother be like? Does she wear pants? I asked. Miss Agnes laughed. Goodness, no. And she'd have had a fit if she'd ever seen me in them. Well, then how come you didn't go to England after you left Alcaquete? Did Sam really kidnap you? She put one eyebrow up in a funny way she had. I was almost on my way home when he came by the hotel in Fairbanks with Dr. Ryan, the superintendent. Dr. Ryan said he had a hard time getting this school set up, and he was going to lose it if I didn't take this job, just for 1 year until he could find someone else. Oh, I said again. I'm glad Sam did that. Then I thought of how long it had been since she'd been home. Was your mother sad that you weren't coming home? Miss Agnes gathered all the pencils on her desk together and put them in the drawer. My mother died 2 years ago, she said. Miss Agnes will only stay here a year, I told Bertha. Bertha looked sad. I knew it, she said. I hope I learn to spell real good before she goes. Then I can write her letters. Chapter 8. The next day I forgot my lunch and Bacco brought it to me. She knocked on the door and then stepped in, looking frightened. She put the lunch on my desk and started toward the door. Miss Agnes looked very surprised. She put her hand on Bacco's shoulder. Bacco looked at the floor. Where did you come from? She asked Bacco. When Bacco didn't answer, Agnes looked at me. She's deaf, I said. She can't hear you. She can't talk. Deaf, said Miss Agnes, still surprised. Why hasn't she been coming to school? The others looked at Miss Agnes as if she was crazy. She can't learn nothing. She's deaf, said Charlie Boy. Nonsense, said Miss Agnes. Why hasn't she been sent to school for the deaf? Is she related to you? She asked me. She's my sister, I said. How old is she? She's 12, like me, said Toby Joe. Do both of you live with your mother? Yes, I said. Does your mother know about schools for the deaf? Yes, I said. Grandpa made her bring Bacco to this school the first year the school opened. The teacher said she didn't know how to teach deaf kids and Bacco should go to a special school. Mama got mad. She said Bacco didn't need no school. She said it's a bum to go so far away. Bacco's learning to cook, and she can sew pretty good. Everyone was feeling pretty nervous now because Miss Agnes was not happy about Bacco. She must come to school from now on, said Miss Agnes. I'll speak to your mother. She took Bacco by the hand. The rest of you finish your lunch. I'm going to have a little talk with Bacco. She put her arm around Bacco and pointed to her. You, she said. Bacco understood that. Then Miss Agnes looked at me. Bacco? What kind of name is that? I don't know. That's just what Grandma started to call her when she was little. Some kind of Indian name, I think. Well, does she have another name? I don't think so, I said. How do you spell it? I don't know. I never saw anybody spell it. Well, I never, said Miss Agnes. We never saw her surprised yet, but Bacco sure did it. She started to write Bacco's name on a piece of paper. You, she said. She pointed to Bacco and then to her name written on paper. Then she put the pencil in Bacco's hand and held her hand so that Bacco wrote her name too. You are Bacco. She did it again and again so Bacco would know. And then she took a piece of that tape and wrote Bacco's name on the empty desk. Bacco pinched her lips together and looked at all of us. We looked at each other. Miss Agnes was going to teach Bacco. I don't know what Miss Agnes said to Mama, but Bacco did come to school. Not the very next day, because Mama was kicking up a big fuss about Bacco having no clothes and her socks having holes in them. But the day after, Mama had a big fight with Grandpa about it. She said who was going to help her at home if me and Bacco were in school, and what good would school do Bacco anyway if she couldn't hear anything? And she wished there never was a school here, and that skinny white woman was too nosy. But Grandpa told Mama to Dalek, be quiet, and he told her he always knew there was a way for Bacco to learn, so that skinny white woman was a good woman who would help our Bacco. When Mama stamped out the door, Grandpa lit his old pipe. Then he pointed at me and said real crabby, your mama had a hard life, you know. It's hard to have a baby born deaf. And when your daddy got sick and went away and died, a hard luck person like that could get kind of mean. You got to think about that. Like I was the one who yelled at her, not him. When Sam White flew in with the mail that afternoon, Miss Agnes had a long talk with him at the store. And the next time Sam came in with the mail, there were special books for Bacco. Sign language, a way Bacco could learn to talk with her hands. This sign language is really something. Miss Agnes said when people have been doing it a long time, their hands just fly. I'd like to see that. And that's not all deaf people can learn to do. Miss Agnes said there's a way deaf people can learn to look at your mouth when you're talking and to know what you're saying that way. She said she would teach Baco to in a special She said they would teach that to Baco in a special school for the deaf if she went. We all got tickled with that idea and started talking to each other without making a sound. Only we'd make our mouths really stick out when we did it. It was so funny, Charlie Boy fell off his chair laughing. Then Roger started saying bad words in Indian with his mouth, and everyone started giggling. Then Miss Agnes told us about a way that blind people can read. We were pretty interested in that because of old blind Simon. He's been blind for a long time because he got whipped across the eyes with a willow branch when he was out trapping. That's what he told us. I bet he would like to know about the blind reading. We all practiced making bumps on our paper by pushing a pin through and then trying to see if we could tell how many bumps there were when we had our eyes closed. That was really hard. Roger had scars all over his hands and fingers from the time he burned himself putting gas in the stove to start a fire. Roger said he couldn't feel a single bump with his fingers. Miss Agnes said he'd better take good care of his eyes then. Roger looked pretty serious about that. Here we used to think some things were so bad you just had to give in to them, like being deaf or blind. But now we were finding out there's always something they've thought of to help people like that. It was hard to do this sign language and blind reading, but it's better to kick some instead of just thinking. While we were doing our morning work, the writing and arithmetic, Miss Agnes would work with Baco. Together they learned the alphabet. You do this alphabet with just one hand, because if you use two hands, then deaf people couldn't talk if they were holding something. Miss Agnes would show Baco the picture of the letter in the book. Then Baco would make the sign, and then Miss Agnes would have her write the letter on paper, the little letter and the big one. Miss Agnes would say the letter, and Baco would make her mouth go the same way Miss Agnes's did. We all learned the sign language alphabet. We couldn't help but watch them. Baco learned it faster than Miss Agnes, and Charlie Boy learned it faster than anyone. Goodness, Miss Agnes would say in a disgusted way, I wish I had a 6-year-old brain. Charlie Boy could do all things like that, really. He was only 6, but when we played ball games, he was the best thrower and the best catcher. He could run faster than anyone, and he could climb up to the top of a tree like a squirrel, and he could do somersaults and cartwheels. He wasn't any good at school stuff, really. He wasn't really good at anything you sat still for, but he was the best at sign language. Miss Agnes watched him and said, I think sign language is as much an athletic skill as a language. She meant if you're good at stuff like Charlie Boy, you do the sign language easier. Soon Baco could ask all of us to tell her our name, and we could do it in sign language, and then we'd ask her name, and she'd sign it for us. Baco was so happy knowing everyone's real name. Baco had made up names for all of us in the village, but only I knew what they meant. Like Old Man Anderson, he had such a big belly that Baco would curve her hand above her stomach for his name. And for Mama, she'd pretend to make a bow of her apron strings. Mama always tied hers around the front, and I knew who that meant. And then Miss Agnes said it was too long to spell out everyone's names and signs, so we just used initials. I was Fred, so she told Baco to just make the little F sign over her heart to show I was her sister. After Mama wasn't acting so crabby about Baco coming to school, Baco went home one day and tapped Mama on the arm to make her pay attention. Then she made the sign for Mama, her thumb under her chin. That means Mama, I said. Then Baco smiled that smile she got from our daddy, and she made the sign for Pretty. That means you're pretty, Mama, I said. Mama's face went so stiff for a moment that I felt nervous. Then she ducked her head away and went on with her sewing. You girls act foolish, she said in some sort of a funny voice, not looking at us. The next day, Mama wrapped up a loaf of her good bread in a towel and told us to take it to school for Miss Agnes. We were so surprised, we just stared at her for a moment. Mama frowned at us as mean as she could. That teacher don't look like she eats nothing, she said, like it's our fault Miss Agnes was so skinny. That's how we knew Mama wasn't mad at Miss Agnes anymore.